It's finally time to start talking about Hyper-V on Windows Server 2016. So if you don't know, this video is part of a playlist on YouTube called the Windows Server 2016 Mega Series, in which I try to build an infrastructure with Windows Server 2016 while presenting different technologies like Hyper-V, of course. And this video will mark the start of a series of videos about Hyper-V. So everything will be Hyper-V related, a couple of videos on in this series. First, let's talk a little about history. The Hyper-V role was revived or reinvented starting with Windows Server 2012, because Windows Server 2012 was the first OS from Microsoft that had this emblem of cloud-ready OS, and Hyper-V played a really big part in that. Of course, in Windows Server 2012 R2, Hyper-V received a lot of updates which made it better, and in Windows Server 2016 it received even more updates and enhancements, which of course makes it even better. And some of these enhancements and new things are listed here. The first one is also one of the biggest in my opinion, and it's called nested virtualization. This will permit you to install Hyper-V in a Hyper-V VM and install and run virtual machines in that VM. So this makes building test labs a whole lot easier than it did in the past. This feature will be explored in the next video in the series. Next, Secure Boot. Now Secure Boot is supported also on Linux virtual machines. And if you don't know what Secure Boot is, this basically is a feature that will help you sleep better at night, because what it does is that it checks using certificates that the code used to boot a specific server has not been tampered with. Next is something that you will not see directly with your eyes, but it's a big improvement, and it's the fact that Hyper-V Manager now uses WSMan to communicate with Hyper-V hosts. So whenever you add a new host in Hyper-V Manager, the communication channel will be over WSMan. Next is PowerShell Direct, and the analogous technology to PowerShell Direct, which I can give you an example of, is the console of Hyper-V. So when you are on a host, you can use the Hyper-V console to see the Hyper-V screen and connect to that virtual machine, even though the network, for example, is not configured. PowerShell Direct does exactly the same thing, but with PowerShell. So this means that you can use PowerShell remoting on a Hyper-V virtual machine from the Hyper-V host without even needing to configure any network settings, because instead of using TCP/IP, it will use the VM bus. One other big improvement is the fact that now migrations of virtual machines from 2012 R2 to 2016 are much more granular and much more user-friendly. What I mean is that when you migrate a virtual machine from 2012 R2 to 2016, you can also migrate it back in case something went wrong. This was not possible in the past from 2012 to 2012 R2. And of course, there are many other new features or enhanced features that are present in Windows Server 2016. Some of these features listed here and others not listed we will see in future videos in this series. But next I want to talk about some things that will not be mentioned specifically in any further videos, and these are different topics related to Hyper-V. The first one I want to start with is dynamic memory. In Windows Server 2012, on Hyper-V of course, the memory allocation has been vastly improved. So from 2012 and onward, we had two types of memory allocation settings. we could have VMs with static memory, which means that if you assign a VM 512 megabytes of RAM, then it would take 512 megabytes of RAM from that host and keep it occupied. The other memory setting possible was dynamic memory, and this is the big improvement actually. With dynamic memory, you could give the VM a minimum and a maximum amount, and the memory used from the host would fluctuate as the VM would need or not need that memory. And with this in mind, there are three memory settings to take into consideration when talking about dynamic memory. First is the startup memory. This amount of RAM is used when the machine first starts up, and it usually needs a little more memory than it would need, for example, in the idle state, because usually at startup all computers need a burst of resources, a little more resources than they would need when they are not doing too many things. The next setting is the minimum memory, and this, by the name, means that this is the minimum amount of memory that the machine can have. So in case it is in idle state, usually this will be the amount that the machine would take up. It cannot go lower than this. And we also have, of course, maximum memory, which is the maximum amount of memory that a machine can allocate. Moving from memory, let's get to storage. We are going to talk about fixed and dynamic disks in Hyper-V. Fixed disks are disks that when creating them and you specify the size of the disk, this will be the size that the disk will actually take up on the physical storage. So you make a disk of 10 gigabytes, that file will have 10 gigabytes. Dynamic disks, on the other hand, will not take up more space than there is in the virtual machine that uses the disk. Meaning that if you create a dynamic disk of 10 gigabytes and is brand new, it will probably only consume a couple of megabytes on the physical disk. Once you start putting things on that virtual disk, also the file will increase in size until it reaches its maximum. And disk types can be converted either using the graphical interface or PowerShell. So you can make a dynamic disk into a fixed disk or vice versa. Now let's get also to networking. And we are talking specifically about the Hyper-V switch. In Windows Server 2012, the Hyper-V switch got a very big rewrite, let's say, because in the past it was much simpler, but in 2012 R2 the Hyper-V switch was reinvented. And of course the switch is a software device that lets you connect VMs either between themselves or with the host or with external networks. And with that said, there are three types of switches. First is the external switch, and this one when you create it, you will link it to one of the host's network adapters, and this permits VMs that are connected to this switch to access the outside network through that network adapter. Then we have the internal switch, and this one will permit you to connect the VMs with the host, but the VMs will not be able to reach the outside network. The last switch type is the private switch, and in this type, VMs connected to a private switch will only be able to communicate between them and not also with the host or the outside network. One other thing I want to mention in this video is Windows Server editions. So for Windows Server we have three main editions, especially related to Hyper-V. First is the standard, and this one is interesting because when you buy a standard license, you get the license for the host, but you also get 2 licenses for 2 virtual machines. So basically you buy a license, you get free Windows servers. We move on to data center, which for a specific license you buy, you get the license for the host and unlimited virtual machines on that host. And the last edition is the Hyper-V server. This one is free, so you can download it and install it for free, but it also does not have any licenses included. So whatever Windows VMs you put on it, you have to have license for them. But if you want, for example, to use Linux VMs, just install Hyper-V server, install your Linux VMs, and you will not have to pay anything. So this was it for an introduction to Hyper-V. Starting with the next video, we are going to see different Hyper-V features that I mentioned in this video, or maybe some that I didn't mention, so stay tuned. Like the video and share it if it was helpful for you, and subscribe to the channel to see when I post new videos. Thanks a lot for watching.